Hi, I'm McLoughlin, and this is my submission for the Massolit video essay competition. Today we're going to be discussing the evolution of tanks throughout the Second World War. But, in order to talk about tanks, we need examples. So, here we are at the Tank Museum. To fully understand the development of tanks throughout the Second World War, it's important to have a baseline as to what was already available. An example of this is the Mark I tank, the father of all tanks. Coming in at 28 tons with a top speed of just 3.7 miles an hour, this tank was the first to cross the trenches of no man's land. It had an armament of 2 cannons and 3 machine guns, and just enough armour to stop a rifle caliber bullet. On the other end of the spectrum we have the French FT-17. With a crew of just 2 compared to the Mark I's 8, it was lighter and more nimble. A top speed of 4.7 miles an hour, granted not that much better, and about the same armour. Moving swiftly on to the early war period, we have our first tank, the Italian L3 or Caravoloce. This light tank started production in 1935 with 2,500 units being made. Armed with 2 8mm machine guns and with a top speed of 26 miles an hour, this tank was certainly versatile. It weighed in at just 3.2 tons with its crew of only 2 men, driver and machine gunner. Now, this was a good example of a tankette, an idea that was tried amongst numerous nations at the time. Other examples include the Polish TKS or British Carden-Loyd carrier. Now, these tanks ultimately ended up being a failure. There wasn't much point in manufacturing them because their impact on the battlefield was just too small. They lacked sufficient armament and armour to do anything important. Now, the reason the Italian government decided to go with tankettes as to a more conventional tank is because of their doctrine. They believed that this war, World War II, would be fought in much the same way as the last, World War I, in which Italy did an awful lot of fighting in the mountainous terrain of the Alps. However, in World War II this was not to be, and the L3 went up against much heavier armed tanks in the plains of North Africa. Our next tank is the Panzer II. Also starting production in 1935, 3,500 of these tanks were made. They were armed with a 20mm autocannon and crewed with 3 men rather than 2. The armour, 5 to 15mm, later upgraded to 35mm after the experiences of German volunteers in the Spanish Civil War. They found that the anti-tank guns used by their opponents were very effective at taking out their tanks, an experience shared by many other countries at the time, and thus decided to upgrade their armour. Now, this tank was a good example of how ergonomics and a versatile 360-degree rotating turret can much better increase the effectiveness of your tank. Moving on to the mid-war period, we have 1941's Crusader. The Crusader was a British cruiser tank. Now, cruiser tanks were an idea exclusive to the British. With their focus on firepower and speed while neglecting armour, they were designed to do the role of cavalry of old by exploiting a breakthrough, going through and causing devastation behind enemy lines. 5,300 of this tank were produced with the famous 6-pounder 57mm anti-tank gun, renowned for its armour-piercing capabilities. This tank had a whopping 51mm of armour and an astonishing power-to-weight ratio of 17 horsepower per tonne. This tank was famous for its use in the North African campaign. Battles such as El Alamein showed a number of weaknesses with its reliability. Tank crews would often find sand blowing up into the engine air vents, clogging up the engines and breaking them down. It was a new aspect of tank design that hadn't really been encountered before, however, certainly a very important one. This is the T-34, the famous Soviet medium tank. As you can see, this one has been recaptured by the Germans and colourfully decorated. 57,000 of these tanks were produced during the Second World War. 57,000! They had 47mm of armour on their frontal plate, but perhaps more important was its angle at 60 degrees. This helps to bounce off incoming shots and increases the effective thickness of the armour. It was one of the first tanks to have a fully angled frontal plate. It also had a 3-inch F-34 cannon with very considerable firepower. Now, this tank had some issues as well. It was extremely unreliable, extremely cramped, and had many issues with ergonomics. Some tanks during the height of Operation Barbarossa weren't even fitted with seats for the crew. However, it also has a story of its own, a development. Starting production in 1940, they were equipped with the L11, an underpowered gun. It then switched to the F-34, much better, and finally the ZIS S-53, an 85mm cannon with very high penetration. The T-34 is a wonderful example of the importance of both hard factors and soft factors. Hard factors are things that you would find on a top trumps card: gun, armour, mobility, whereas soft factors are the more practical side of things: crew comfort, reliability, gun depression. Both are important to have an effective tank. In the late war period, we have the Jagdtiger. Produced from 1944, only 80 of them were made. This tank had an enormous 128mm gun, a caliber that we're only just reaching with today's modern tanks. It weighed a whopping 72 tons, making it completely impractical to cross most bridges. It also had 10 inches of armour on the casemate, 250mm, with a crew of 6, 2 of them just to load shells. This tank was the ultimate evolution of the World War II tanks arms race. It had it all: massive gun, loads of armour, lackluster mobility. But it was so impractical to make and completely unreliable, constantly breaking down under the stress of its weight, that it ultimately completely failed as an effective tank. My last tank of the late war period is an American one. Now, you tank enthusiasts out there might think I've picked the Sherman, but you'd be wrong. I picked the Chaffee. Starting production in 1944, 4,731 of these tanks were made. This light tank had a 5-man crew and a 75mm gun, and it used torsion bar suspension. Now, I've picked this tank because it's a good example of how a light tank in the late war has the same characteristics as a medium tank in the mid-war. The 5-man crew had become standard for the time, but was unheard of for a light tank, fitting all those men in such a tight space. Furthermore, the 75mm gun made it extremely useful for infantry support, but again, light tanks were meant to mount smaller calibers. It was a great modern light tank and showed how it could be done for the future. Furthermore, it used torsion bar suspension, a brilliant style of suspension which is still used today. Any discussion about development of tanks throughout the Second World War would be incomplete without at least mentioning the Centurion. Now, this tank came out slightly after the war in 1945, however had been developed during the war period. It used experiences learned by all nations in tank battles from Europe to the Middle East all the way into Asia. It combined good armour, a great gun with decent mobility, and great crew ergonomics and other soft factors, good reliability. It was in essence the first main battle tank, the type of tank that all nations use today. As we've seen, tanks have gone through major evolutions during the so-called golden age of tanks. We saw technological developments that would have taken decades during peacetime take just a few years or even months during the war. Tanks went from small, lightly equipped vehicles, only good enough for infantry to support, to the large, heavy, armour-penetrating beasts that we know today, our main battle tanks.